Hello everyone, welcome to this video. In this video, I want to talk about the SQL storage implementation in Ionic 2. I don't know Ionic 1, so if you are coming from Ionic 1, maybe you are comfortable watching this video, maybe you are not comfortable watching this video. But I wanted to make this video for the users who are either wanting to implement SQL storage or already have implemented SQL storage and they're just checking out what others have done, because I faced a lot of problems while I was doing this, because in the Ionic official v2 docs I couldn't find much of helpful examples. So I had to search the internet, and I came across a few hints from Stack Overflow and GitHub, but I actually had to implement everything from scratch pretty much. So that's exactly what we are going to be doing today. And I have my main project which I did with SQL storage, and this is basically an advanced version of to-do app. So if I want to refer to any code, I'll just refer to this project, but in a separate window I have a new project which is the default project that comes with the Ionic 2 when you say Ionic2 start. And I'm using TypeScript obviously, and therefore I'm using Visual Studio Code, which has excellent support for TypeScript. So let's just get started. And this tutorial is obviously going to be very informal because it's my first one and I'm not used to video tutorials. So, and by no means I am an expert, so if you think I made a mistake or if you would like to give me a suggestion, you are most welcome. So I want to implement something like this. I want to implement a table which has 3 columns: a ID, a username, and then age. And obviously if you look at the second record, the Seth username with Seth has not already been born, so the age is 0. Obviously this is just for fun, but we want to implement this as a SQL storage in the form of tables, I mean relational database. So let's think about how we are going to be doing this. So we have a default project structure here. So we have the app folder, we have the typings folder, and all of that. So app.ts is the main starting point of all of our Ionic2 applications. First of all, we need to create a new page. I already created that and I called it start page. You can see the import statement of the start page here, and I replaced the tabs page, which was the default root page for Ionic2 application, with my start page. So this means that when I start my Ionic2 app, I'll see the start page, and start page is basically this page. So you can see nothing much is going on, it's just a basic page. Hopefully in the future we can implement a ng-for or something like that, but right now it's almost like a placeholder right now. But if you look at the TypeScript version, this is where all of our code will go, and I just ignore this red line for now. We are going to add all of our logic and everything in this file, ts file, so it's a very important file. Besides that, we need a main, kind of like a factory file or like a service, which is going to implement the actual SQL storage, and we are going to pass in that storage, or that service, as a provider in the app.ts file. We have a array for providers, so here we are going to add our own data service. And since this is a provider and we are adding this in the root component, what that basically means is that all of our components will inherit this. And by inherit I mean, if we basically have a child component of the main component, and in the constructor we uh, create an object of this data service. We can definitely do that because we already have the provider for that, and that's the whole concept of provider. We can add a service in the providers array, and then later on in our application, in our any of the child components, we can use that data service in the constructor and in the component. So let's just do that. Okay, so first of all we need to create a provider. I have already done that, and I have deleted all the code that comes default with the provider, since we are not interested in making asynchronous API calls. We are interested in implementation of SQL storage, so I just replaced that with I deleted that, and now I'll just refer to my main project for certain things, and I'll explain you everything. So let me just copy this chunk. Okay, so basically what we are doing here is we are creating an injectable which we can an injectable is obviously an Angular 2 concept. We can read more about that in the official Angular 2 docs, and I'm not going to talk much about that in this video, but the main focus should be on storage and SQL storage. These two are the objects, or I guess components, that we are importing from Ionic Angular library. And it's not very obvious when you go to the official v2 docs. They don't mention this import statement explicitly, so I had to discover this myself. So the main method that we are going to be using with storage is the query method, but before that we need to initialize the storage object. Before we initialize the storage object, we need to actually create a temporary object called storage, and you can just call say it's null, and then in the constructor we can say this dot storage is equal to a new storage object which is of type SQL storage. And we can obviously do that since we have imported storage and SQL storage from the Ionic Angular library. So since we have this dot storage, which is a SQL storage object, we can call the main query method, which is what we are going to be using quite a lot, and this basically returns a promise. We will see the structure of promise and how to handle the promise later on in start.ts file, but for now you can just think that we are running any query with this this dot storage dot query method, and it will return a promise that we can see how to handle later on. And in this query we can basically have any SQL query, and what we have right now is the basic initial query, as I like to call it, because it's only going to run once. Because what it's basically saying is that if the table is already existing, which is called to do, don't do anything, but if the table is not existing, just create that table, and if you run it again, it's not going to do anything. So it's basically very simple. It's only going to create the table once. That's why I just like to call it the initial query. Now since we want to implement this table, I think more appropriate name should be users, so I'll just say users. That's the name of our table. Now okay, so this is primary key and ID, which is an integer. This is the first column. The second column I think is username, so username, which is of type text, right? And then the third column is age, which is of type integer. It doesn't, I know it's not integer, but you can just go with integer for now, since we cannot have ages in negative. So integer, and then we don't need the fourth column, just ignore that, and we are done. Okay, save it. Sorry, so we have the main query, which is create table. We are going to be running, obviously this is going to create the table for the first time in our database. Now we need a method to actually retrieve the users that are already present in our database and in our table. So let's just say that the method is called get users, and it's something like this. So we are going to return the promise that we are getting from storage.query method. So return this dot storage dot query, and then we are going to run the most basic query in all of the SQL, which is the select query. And obviously this is the simplest query. Select star from the name of the database, which is users, and yeah, that's it. So when we call our service and we call the get users method, it's going to return the promise. Yeah, so that's it. Okay, so now let's just see how we are going to import this data.ts provider in our app.ts file, which is the main file. But before that, we need to create the page. I have already created my own page, which is called start, and yeah, so this is called start, and the actual class name is actually start page. The name of the page is start, but the export class name is start page, so keep that in mind. And I am importing my start page here in this app.ts file. Now what I need to do is I need to import the data service that we just created. So import from this is a relative path, so it's going to be providers. Here you go, and then data, and then data. If I don't see any red line, that means it should be correct. So the path is correct. Now I need to import data service. So there you go, auto completion, thanks to auto completion. So I'll just hit save. Now I need to pass this data service as a provider. Again, I'm not going to talk about providers and injectable. This is an Angular 2 concept. So data service, there you go. Now I think we are all good. Now we need to go to start.ts, and I've actually already imported the data service in this file. Now we need to actually create the object or inject the service in this class or this component, which is called the start page. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this data, and this is obviously going to be of type data service, which we have already imported. And now we can use the methods of the data service, which are like get users, only one method right now. Okay, so let's just see the syntax. So like I said, it returns a promise, and it returns two objects in callback functions. So the first is an object, a transaction object. I'll just call it tx, and I am using the ES6 arrowhead functions. And the second function has the object called error, if there's any error, and again using the arrowhead notation, ES6. And then I'll just console log the values of both of the objects, so you see the structure of the objects that we are actually retrieving from the promise. So tx, transaction, and error, console.log error object. All right, now we have a problem here, because we have created the table, or we are going to be creating a table when we run this application, but we haven't actually stored any records, so we need to store records. So for that we need to go back to our data service, data.ts files in the providers and data subfolder. We need to create another method called add users, or just say add, yeah, I'll just say add users. And then I'm going to take the name of the user as the parameter, which is of type string, and I'm going to take so let's just do this serial wise. I'm going to take ID, it's obviously number. I'm going to take name, which is of type string, and then I'm going to take age, which is also of type number, and that's it. That's all we need. And now I'll just call this .storage.query, which is again going to return a promise. And also let's just return this, since this is a function, return this .storage.query, and this is obviously going to be an insert query. Now the syntax of the insert query is a little bit weird, which I found a little bit weird, so I'll just refer to this from my main project. So here it is. It's basically using question marks as, I believe, wild cards or something like that, but it's definitely a little bit weird. So we'll see the syntax right now, and I'm just pasting it right from my main project, and I have the array. I'll just replace this values with my own values that I have in my function arguments. So I'll say ID, and then name, and then age. So we have in total 3 parameters that we want to insert. So I need to remove this question mark. So now we have 3 values or 3 parameters, semicolon obviously, and I'll save this. Now I believe these 3 question marks are like wildcard characters, and what we are passing as the second argument or second parameter of the query function is an array, which actually has all the values that we are looking to insert. So in this case we are looking to insert 3 values, which are ID, name, and age. So I think this should work. Now back to our start.ts file. Before actually retrieving the users, we need to add users. So let's say data dot add users, and again, thanks to the TypeScript integration with VS Code, we see the helper, I guess, strip, which tells us about all the arguments. So the first is ID, let's just say 1, and then name, I'll just use this file, so David, age 23, and let's just insert one more user. So I'll just Control C and Control V. ID is 2 and name is Seth, I believe. Seth, yup, and age is 0. Just a little bit weird, but let's just go with it. Control S. Now I believe this should work, so let's just see if this is working. I have already run the Ionic serve command, so let's just see the output in the browser, and things are not looking good. Unhandled promise rejection. Okay, so I know what is wrong. So if we go back to the data.ts file, I just forgot to change the name from to do to the name of our current table, which is users, and I believe everything is correct. So let's just refresh it. Okay, something is wrong. Transaction error. Let's just look at the error message that we are getting. Okay, so could not prepare statement. One table user has 2 columns but 3 values were supplied. So I believe there's some error with the insertion statement. So select start from users is correct, and username, age, integer. It says one table has user has 2 columns. Well, I think it has 3 columns. Username, age, and okay, so I know what is wrong. So basically when I was actually creating a video, I actually practiced this and I created the table users already. So it's not creating a new table, it's actually considering that old table, and in that old table I already had 2 columns. So now since I am having 3 columns, so it's saying that I cannot insert 3 values into that table which already has 2 columns. So basically you can do one thing, you can change the name of the table to users underscore user. Let's just say we drop the s, we just say user, and so from here user, and from here user. Let's see what happens now. There you go, you don't see any error object. So what that basically means is success. There's not any error. So let's just examine the structure of the promise, I mean the objects returned by promise. So we see a transaction, SQL transaction object tx, and instead of the error we see result. So in the transaction basically we see the proto object, but in the result we see the rows that are in the table. So we see 2 rows, David and Seth, and if you look at other parameters, age is 23, ID is 1 for David, and age is 0, ID is 2 for Seth. That is exactly what we wanted, right? And I want you to look at the structure of what we have received in the console log and pattern match it with the where we called the add users and get users function. So when we called get users, I said .then, and then as a callback I had a function with a parameter tx, which was the transaction object. This corresponds to this transaction object that you see here, and then in the second callback function, or the second function with error as the parameter, I said console.log error. Now what happens is that when we don't have any errors, or when we don't encounter any errors, this error object is actually replaced by the result object. So what we have instead here is the result. So if there was any error, this result would be replaced by the error object, and that would have been printed in the console. But since we don't have any error, it's a result, and what we were looking to do has been successful. So thanks for watching this video. I believe we can just go and adding and removing stuff and just using basic SQL queries, but we can also just like start an ng-for in this HTML file and throw in some Angular 2 logic to actually create a list of all the users that we are storing in the database. So we can try to do that. So let's what do you say? So let's just do this. So Okay, so for that we need to create a users. Let's just say we only want to show the name of the users for simplicity. So let's just create a users array where users is equal to 0. That's not how we declare arrays in TypeScript, right? um, yeah, so users, which is an number array. There you go. And once we get the users, I want to say, um, so again I want you to look at this result object. Here we see a sub object which is called a property called rows, and then we see all of our data, right? So what we need to do is, in order to map all the rows with the users array, we need to do this. We need to say tx dot rows dot dot result, sorry, dot result dot rows, and then dot map, and then this is going to take a function with item as a parameter, uh, and then we are just going to apply the map logic, and we are going to say that this dot users uh, dot push item dot name, right? That's exactly what we wanted to do. I need to double check the name of the column was name or username. So in the data.ts file, so it is username and not name. So username. So let's see if this code is working correctly. Something is wrong. Error, could not execute statement due to constraint failure, unique constraint. Okay, so I know what is wrong. Since we are just passing in like hard coded values uh, in app.ts file, I mean, where's the page? In my page.ts. No, no, no. This is a different project. Oh, in start.ts file, we are just like hard coding the values for add users. We need to change this to like, let's just delete this and say 3 and create a new record. Let's say, I don't know, Sarah. So the errors should vanish, because basically what the errors were saying is that I am violating the uniqueness constraint or the primary constraint. Okay, so that those errors got vanished, but we have a new error and says tx.res.rows.map is not a function, because I believe that tx.res.rows is not an array, but it's an object. So it's an iterable object, right? Because if you look at this, look at result, you and rows, you see 0 1 2 all these labels, and you also see the length property. So this is definitely an iterable, right? We can iterate over this. So what we can do is we can use so let's just ignore this for now. We can use array dot let's call this temp, and then what we can do is just replace this with temp. So temp dot map, and then for each item what we are saying is that push the item dot username property in the users array that we created. Now one thing to note here is that Visual Studio Code and TypeScript is acting a little weird here, because I was also getting this error in my main project, and it turns out that it's actually uh, not to bother. Like, you don't need to bother about this, because it's something like the Ionic 2 team should have implemented in their code base. They should have fixed this, because it's basically a TypeScript error, I believe, and it's saying that the username does not exist on this object. But if you look at the results, I think there shouldn't be any error. It makes perfect sense, and it's working, and we'll see that it's working. So oops, okay, so I know what is wrong. So again, it's that we need to change this for uniqueness constraint. Now obviously we are using hard-coded values, but obviously when you are implementing a real production application, you are not going to be doing these kind of things, right? So let's say Jerry and 23, let's just go with that, and item dot user. Let's see what happens now. Okay, so let's see what is going wrong now. This is interesting. User.id is already existing, should not be the let's verify if the ID4 is already existing. It is not, so I think it needs one more refresh. uh, Error, tx.res.map. Okay, I think it is not there's some error in live reload, so let's just run Ionic serve once again. uh, just ignore this red line. I'm damn sure that this is not an error, because I've already created the main project in which I use SQL storage, and in that project I have many red statements like this with the same exact error message, but the application works exactly fine. So we need to see what is wrong. Okay, so let's just see what is going on here. What the heck? So something is terribly wrong. Username does not exist. uh, I believe since I was using a new version, like I just started this project from scratch, and for my earlier project I was using an earlier version, they might have done something different, so that's why it's not loading. So what I'll do is um, I'll just remove this. So I'll just remove this statement, and we can just print tx dot rows result dot basically it's converting the iterable to a new array, and once I have the new array, I am calling the map function, and then using that map function I am creating a new array, and then I am saying this dot to do items, the items array that I have already created for this component class. I am equating that with my newly created array. So that's pretty much it. So uh, let me see if I can so let's just try one last time. Okay, so I'll just try one